Good morning, everyone. It's so good to have you with us today. Pardon my laughter. I'm excited to see all of you and to have you back for day 2 of the Reimagine Religious Freedom virtual conference. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, and the curator of the Religious Freedom Mobile Institute. And I bring you greetings as a guest on Native Acostan lands of the Pamunkey and Piscataway tribes outside of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. I would also like to take a moment this morning and just thank our sponsors for their incredible support of this event. You can see their logos before you on this slide, and we're so thankful to Union Theological Seminary, Chicago Theological Seminary, Wake Forest School of Divinity, the First Amendment Museum, Interfaith Alliance, the National Council of Jewish Women, Shoulder to Shoulder, Wesley Theological Seminary, the Open Church of Maryland, Union Presbyterian Seminary, Star King School for the Ministry, the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and Network Lobby for supporting us in these efforts today and yesterday and tomorrow, right? Also, I want to thank those of you that were individual donors that supported this event. Thank you to all of you for your generous support and providing an opportunity for us to share these educational opportunities with others. And so I would like to take this moment to just acknowledge that there has been a giant in the Black church community to transition. This morning, we learned of the passing of the Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts III. He was the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York for over 30 years. And this is a huge loss to his family, but also to his faith community and to the Harlem community. Dr. Butts was an advocate for justice and freedom. And so I want us to center our morning by this quote by Dr. Butts, and it reads, "Everything that we are about as African people in terms of our struggle for justice and freedom started in the church. There is no separation of the sacred and secular, of the church and state in Black America. There is no separation." And I read that quote knowing that the experiences of Black Americans in this country has been different from many others, but we recognize also that we are alongside our brothers and sisters that are of religious and non-religious minority communities, as well as walking alongside our brothers and sisters that identify as LGBTQIA individuals, and so many others that continue to be marginalized in this country. Our fight for freedom and justice will continue. And today, we just want to honor a giant in our community that has given his life to doing and advancing this work. And so we wish the family our condolences, and we hope that you continue to remember his legacy and his presence and his humanity as you go forward in acknowledging your loved one. So I want to pivot to say, for those of you who missed last night's opening session and keynote, you missed a powerful discussion. Last night, we had Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, Amanda Tyler, Paul Rauschenbusch, and Michael Vasquez, who provided a thought-provoking conversation and dialogue about Christian nationalism. You can take down this slide for a moment. A thought-provoking dialogue about Christian nationalism. And our presenters took the time to distinguish the dangerous ideology that suggests what it means to be American is that you have to align with white Christian values or to proclaim to be a patriot, versus looking at the religious tradition that is practiced by millions of Americans. Even though the US is not a Christian nation, was not founded as a Christian nation. Keep that in mind. In his final remarks, our moderator, Michael Vasquez, who is brilliantly working behind the scenes this morning, affirms that Christian nationalism is not make-believe, it's real. And it has played and continues to play a role in shaping public policies that target America's most vulnerable and marginalized communities. This year, many of us sat in awe or in shock as the justices of the Supreme Court rolled back decisions from the 1973 landmark case of Roe versus Wade that made it illegal to criminalize women for having abortions in Texas. Earlier this year, there were many concerted efforts to undermine voting rights. In 2021 alone, there were a host of pieces of legislation that were passed to restrict voting access at the state level. To be exact, there were 34 laws in total passed in 19 states, and hundreds have been introduced this year across the nation. In the beginning of this year, in 2022, the Senate failed to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Yet there have been gerrymandering efforts to redistrict areas that give a political candidate advantage over another. And this happens, let's be clear, by both parties. Now, we cannot forget the daily battles happening in public education, where, again, the Supreme Court decided in Maine that taxpayer money should support private religious education, which not only violates church-state separation, but it takes money from public schools that serve everyone in the community. What happens when the law like this is applied in a place like my hometown of Petersburg, Virginia, where the public school district is already underfunded and is barely able to serve its students? Finally, as a community, I think all of us that we must think about our most vulnerable population in public schools, our students. We saw in Florida where Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Do Not Say Gay law, prohibiting classroom teachers from teaching lessons about sexual orientation and gender identity in kindergarten through third grade classes, as well as material that they deem that are not age appropriate. While this sends a toxic message to students and teachers who then will feel isolated or targeted because of their identities. And just recently, here in the state of Virginia, the Youngkin administration introduced the Virginia Department of Education's 2022 model policies, which are Christian nationalist and transphobic in many ways. Whereas you suggest that the governor suggested that Virginia parents have the right to make decisions about their children, these policies actually prioritize the ideologies, the rights, and the concerns of a particular group of parents. This will cause great division in the community and in the ways the administration has not considered. Quite candidly, these policies violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution because they show favor towards one religious group over another. Again, that's a form of Christian nationalism. The Trevor Project gives us data that shows us more than 1.8 million LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 to 24 have seriously considered suicide each year in the United States. That data chokes me up because I'm the mother of a 14-year-old. Last week, I had the opportunity to speak to a transgender person, a parent actually, that talked about their concerns for these public policies that might impact their transgender teenage daughter. And then we can't have a conversation about rights without addressing the rights and the concerns of non-religious and secular people in this country. In 2020, American Atheists released a report called Reality Check, Being Non-Religious in America. And in their findings, they talked about that due to their non-religious identity, more than half of the participants, 54.5%, had negative experiences with their family members. 29.4% had negative experiences in education, and more than 1 in 5 had negative experiences in the workplace because of how they show up in the world. Of those who experienced discrimination, there was a higher percentage of depression, and that rate was even higher among communities of color that had less support. So when we're talking about rights in this country, whose rights are we actually talking about? Whose rights are being prioritized? Today's panel discussion allows us to lean into answering that question. So I'm excited to introduce our dynamic panelists who are all working on the front lines, whether it's at grassroots level, at policy, or at policy levels, to protect the rights of so many of the marginalized groups that I've mentioned here in America. And so with that, I want to briefly introduce our presenters. I'm going to introduce them by name and organization, and then I will give a more detailed introduction shortly. So I'm delighted to have with us this morning for our panel, Reimagining Religious Freedom Rights, Andrea Miller, who is with the Center for Common Ground, Reverend Alex Patchin McNeill, who is an ordained minister and an LGBTQ+ advocate. We also have with us Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, Liz Reiner Platt, who is with the law, I'm so sorry, I'm messing up the slides, the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. And we also have with us Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder of Black Nonbelievers. As you can see before you, the slides show who our presenters are. So I want to first invite our first presenter to share a little bit more about her work. And so I will read her bio. We have with us today Andrea Miller, who is a founding board member and executive director for the Center for Common Ground. She's also a part of People Demanding Action, as well as the National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, and a member of the Democracy and Governance Working Group of the Virginia Green Deal. Ms. Andrea is an IT and political director and a digital election strategist. She designs and administers digital phone banks and text programs. And from 2013 to 2015, she led the Progressive Roundtable on Capitol Hill, bringing together members of Congress, activists, and nonprofit leaders. Her area of expertise is voting rights, climate justice, and the Equal Rights Amendment. She has successfully advocated for legislation on both the federal and state level. In 2008, she was a Democratic nominee for the Virginia 4th Congressional District. And I am honored to be a colleague of hers in the Faithful Democracy Working Coalition. And so I'd like to welcome to your screen, Ms. Andrea Miller.
Well, thank you very, very much, Sabrina. Thank you so very much. I've got a slide presentation, and I will be talking about voting rights and or why we don't really seem to have them now. So, Michael, next slide. Our problem in the United States with voting rights for people who were not rich white men basically stems from a flaw in the United States Constitution. Nowhere does it say that all citizens have the right to vote in elections. It was all about who was eligible to vote for the largest house of the state legislature and the US House of Representatives. And they were very explicit. You needed to be white, you needed to be male, you needed to be 21 or older, and you basically needed to be the 1% of your day. You needed to own property. Next slide. Now, one of the other things that happened with the Constitution and is still very, very true is states figured out what they were going to do and how they were going to implement policy. So originally, most states followed the Constitution. You needed to be property owning, and then they kind of expanded it, or tax paying. You still needed to be white, and you still needed to be male. In a few states, New Jersey, free Black men and women who had property rights or paid taxes could vote. Now, Wyoming in 1869, in order to attract women to the territory, granted women the right to vote in 1869. Women across the United States did not get the right to vote until 1920. And in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, they said, if the federal government, the United States Constitution, does not expressly prohibit or require something, basically states can kind of figure out what they want to do. Next slide. Now, we've amended the Constitution 27 times. The three really critical amendments that impacted voting were the 14th, where it basically said, all right, men, and they really meant white men, will have full citizenship and voting rights if they were born or naturalized in the United States. The 15th Amendment basically said we're going to eliminate racial barriers so that Black men will be able to vote. The 19th Amendment in 1920 said we're not going to deny the right to vote on account of sex. Next slide. And then the fastest constitutional amendment that we ever passed was in 1971, when we granted 18-year-olds the right to vote. Now, some of you may remember in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a war going on in Vietnam, and they were drafting 18-year-olds. And the argument was, if they're old enough to carry a gun and die for their country, then they're old enough to vote. Now, the 26th Amendment also paved the way for the civil rights. The 26th Amendment was proposed as part of the reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act. Next slide. Now, because if the Constitution didn't say you couldn't, states had the ability to decide that they would. Once Black men got the right to vote, we had the dirty 13 states who spent time coming up with ways to prevent Black men from voting. And the states in their election laws came up with things like, in order to vote, you had to be tax paying. And if you weren't paying taxes on property, then you basically had to pay a tax to vote, known as a poll tax. Other states were like, people are coming up with money to pay these poll taxes, so we're going to get a little more clever. In order to vote, you've got to be able to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar. All right, how random is that? We also really started seeing felony disenfranchisement, where if you were found guilty of a felony, you lost the right to vote. There are still 4 states where if you are convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote for your lifetime, or unless the governor restores you. That would be Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, and my state of Virginia. They also instituted literacy tests. In 1901, very few people could read, whether they were white or black. That was pretty much relegated to the rich. And because they realized literacy tests were going to prevent white men from voting, they came up with a grandfather clause. Well, if your grandfather can vote, you can vote too. Next slide. In 1965, President Johnson authorized and signed into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So all the things I mentioned in the previous slide basically were, for all intents and purposes, illegal. Next slide. Why were they illegal? Because the Voting Rights Act instituted something called preclearance, where it says if your state or jurisdictions in your states have been guilty of trying to suppress the vote, if you want to make changes to the election laws in your state or your locality, you are going to have to get preclearance from the Department of Justice. Next slide. Now, preclearance was very, very useful. And what we are looking at is, because we don't have a lot of those protections, we are very, very concerned in 2022 about voter intimidation. The Voting Rights Enforcement Clause said that we would have federal election examiners and observers in those jurisdictions where we had evidence that people were going to attempt to intimidate minority voters at the polls. Next slide. Now, one of the issues with the Voting Rights Act was it had to constantly be reauthorized. It wasn't an amendment to the Constitution, so it wasn't forever. And on June 25th in 2013, Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 4, the formula that they used to figure out what states, what areas were going to be required to have preclearance, they said, the rules are 40 years old. Stuff's changed. So we are going to get rid of Section 4. And immediately after that, we saw voter ID laws and all other numbers of changes being enacted by the states. Next slide. Now, reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act was something that consistently had been done under all the presidents. Most of us heard about, many of us advocated for passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act Unfortunately, that is not enough. While it will establish or reestablish pre-clearance, which means states won't be able to enact new laws, it doesn't create a level playing field, saying that all states have to allow everyone to vote. It doesn't establish campaign finance rules, nor does it establish really simple minimum specifications. All states must have early voting. 4 states currently do not. 2 wouldn't surprise you: Alabama, Mississippi. 2 would, Connecticut and New Hampshire. And also all states have to allow no excuse vote by mail. Next slide. So what do we need to do to fix the problem that was inbred in our original Constitution? At the federal level, we do need the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to prevent new laws from popping up on the books. The next thing that we need is the For the People Act, which sets the minimum standards. And now, next slide. The third thing that we need to do is we need to establish once and for all an official constitutional right to vote for everybody. And here is actually the language is very simple. Any citizen of the United States of voting age shall have the fundamental right to vote in any election held in the jurisdiction in which they reside. It's very, very simple and powerful in its statement. So thank you. That's how we got here and what we are going to need to do to permanently solve our voting issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Andrea. What a well-informed presentation. That was a great civics course for us this morning, and history course, in helping us to understand how we got to where we are right now, right? It's so important for us to remember history, and we know that across the country there are a lot of efforts to undermine history, the history as it happened, being taught in classrooms. And so we really appreciate your sharing with us about how these pieces of legislation came into being and then what's necessary for us to move forward. And so I do have some questions that I'll ask during our Q&A session. So I want to introduce our next presenter, Liz Reiner Platt, who's the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. As well as, and the Law, Rights, and Religion Project is a law and policy think tank and advocates for religious liberty, pluralism, and social justice. She publishes widely on the intersection of religious freedom and other fundamental rights. Her recent work includes the Southern Hospitals Report, which examines religious restrictions on medical care at Protestant-affiliated hospitals, the All Faiths and None report, a roadmap to protecting religious freedom and pluralism, and Whose Faith Matters, ? An exploration of religious freedom movements outside the Christian right. And so I now bring to the screen Liz Reiner Platt. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction. And, before diving in, that was a great little intro to my work at the Law, Rights, and Religion Project, or LLRP. Just to dive a little deeper, what do we actually do? We conduct research, we write reports, we file amicus or friend of the court briefs. And we just generally kind of participate in this public conversation, like the public conversation that we're having today about religion and the law. And I've been asked to start my presentation today with a couple extra minutes to give a really super short religion law 101 for everyone, just to get everyone on the same page. So apologies to those for whom this is all very old news, but I saw we had someone from the UK, so hopefully this will be new to at least some folks. Next slide, please. So I'll start with that super short religion law 101. I'll then talk a bit about how the Christian rights about the Christian rights capture of religious liberty sort of as a public term, and how their vision for religious liberty really actually goes beyond the kind of typical culture war issues that we typically focus on. And then finally, I'll end on how we might advance a more pluralistic vision or framework for religious freedom for all of us, touching both on kind of some specific legal actions, but more notably on kind of broader underlying principles. Next slide, please. So here's my kind of super condensed religion law kind of 101 slide. Really, the key takeaway I want to leave you with is that religious liberty is protected under the law in a whole bunch of different ways. It's protected, of course, in the US Constitution through both the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which protects everyone's right to exercise or not their religious beliefs, and the Establishment Clause, which in theory is what protects church-state separation, but as I'm sure we'll get into, has really been whittled down to almost nothing by the current Supreme Court. Religious liberty is also protected in every state's own constitution, which all look a little bit different from each other and are sometimes interpreted a little differently, but in general often have some sort of parallel language to the Federal Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. Religious exercise is also protected by a really broad federal law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. This was the law at issue in the Hobby Lobby case. And RFRA states that anytime the federal government places a burden on your ability to exercise your religion, you have the right to be exempt to not follow that federal law or policy unless enforcing the law on you is the only way that the government can advance an interest of the highest importance. So it's a really broad right to exemptions from federal laws and policies that conflict with your religious practice. And since RFRA currently only restricts acts of the federal government, many states have also passed their own kind of state versions of these RFRA laws granting broad exemption rights. And then religious liberty is also protected in hundreds, if not thousands, of kind of discrete, narrower laws and policies that protect particular religious beliefs or practices. So this is everything from very old, longstanding laws that protect pacifists from having to serve in the military, up to laws creating vaccine exemptions, for example, for school children. And there are countless of these kinds of discrete exemption laws. So that's my quick and dirty overview of religion law, but I want to move on to kind of briefly talk about how the Christian right as a political movement has invested in a decades-long and extremely successful to capture this public meaning of the term religious liberty. So, as we probably all kind of intuit today, when you see an article about religious liberty in the newspaper, you hear about a religious liberty lawsuit, or you hear about a law that's being filed that's going to protect, religious liberty in quotes. It's really probably going to focus on the religious beliefs and rights of one community, and that is white Christians with conservative religious views about sex and gender. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time. And this really warped version of what we talk about when we talk about religious liberty, I think has been adopted kind of so completely in public discourse that it's really almost taken as face value, which is how, for example, you can see, I have a lot of articles like this, but I think this is a really good example, this article on the slide from the New York Times, which states that this imagined new political party discussed in the article that the author labels a Christian conservative party would focus on issues of religious liberty. I think it should be pretty obvious that the Christian conservative party, led by the very same people like Mike Pence who fought for the Muslim ban, is not a party that's fighting for religious liberty. And yet that's the kind of language that we frequently see. So how did this happen? Of course, it's not like there's one reason, but That said, I think one really big reason is that the Christian right has invested enormous financial resources into capturing the idea of religious liberty. And that has created just an enormous disparity in the amount of work that gets done in terms of litigation, policy, media campaigns, et cetera, around religious liberty. So the next slide gives you kind of a sense of the scale of some recent Christian right legal campaigns around key issues for that movement, like contraception, LGBTQ rights, and COVID gathering bans. And to be clear, on this slide, I stopped when I ran out of room. I could have probably 10 more slides like this. They are just bringing so much litigation. It's impossible even to keep up with. More kind of progressive and pluralistic and religious minority faith groups are not engaging on religious liberty issue, law and policy issues on nearly the same scale. There's just not the same investment of time and money and resources. Next slide. But one thing I do kind of just want to note is that the Christian right's vision on religious liberty, while it's certainly focused on those issues we already mentioned of sex, marriage, reproduction, contraception, abortion, in fact, the vision does go beyond these kind of more traditional, what we might call culture war issues. So last month, LLRP reissued a report we called Parading the Horribles, in which we discuss real litigation that has been brought demanding religious exemptions in 10 different issue areas, which you can see in this slide. And I think the most notable ones that I'd want to flag for you are cases demanding religious exemptions from compliance with laws intended to protect workers' rights and the right to organize a union. So again, I just want to emphasize that religious exemptions have absolutely been used not only to advance conservative religious beliefs about sexual morality, but really just the part and parcel of the broader conservative legal movement as a whole, including limiting state administrative power, deregulating the public marketplace, deregulation for businesses, and allocating, as Sabrina already mentioned in her opening remarks, allocating government funding to private entities. Next slide. So what is the alternative to this kind of vision of religious liberty? Well, I always want to make sure to state that we can't just abandon or cede religious liberty narratives or just come up with a new term, which is something I hear sometimes. And why is that? Well, I think most of us know that religious liberty is an important fundamental right. It's essential to our democracy. But also, the vast majority of Americans say religious liberty is important to them. Next slide. So a project that we've been really committed to at LRP is just trying to broaden what the public thinks about when we hear religious liberty. So one piece of this is in 2019, we wrote a report that Sabrina mentioned called Whose Faith Matters, the Fight for Religious Liberty Beyond the Christian Right, that gives a really sweeping overview of religious liberty lawsuits brought by religious folks associated with social justice and humanitarian movements. And as I mentioned before, these are much fewer and far between, much less scattered, less organized than the Christian right, but there's still many of them. So the report covered lawsuits brought, for example, by people of faith who had been arrested for leaving food and water in the desert for migrants, Native American and Catholic groups seeking to protect their sacred sites from having roads or pipelines built on them, clergy members who sued to perform same-sex marriage back when that was illegal in many states, faith-based organizations seeking to open safe injection sites for people who use drugs, and a host of other cases. Next slide. And more recently, we have been digging much deeper into past and current suits articulating a religious liberty right to seek, offer, or facilitate abortion care. We issued a report on this issue specifically in August, and we hope to be able to update it periodically as we start to see more and more of these kinds of lawsuits. And the report covers a lot of the history of groups like the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, which was a group of religious leaders who helped people find safe ways to get an abortion in the years before Roe v. Wade. And a couple of those clergy members actually did at that time bring lawsuits arguing that they had a religious liberty right to provide this kind of help to pregnant people. And then it also discusses many of the ongoing religious right to abortion cases that are currently being litigated in states like Utah, Wyoming, Florida, Kentucky, Indiana, Texas, and other states. And now finally, I want to mention that in 2020, LLRP partnered with Auburn Seminary to publish a report that really thought through kind of the whole religious liberty landscape of these countless different beliefs, different legal claims, and tried to articulate kind of 6 underlying principles for protecting religious liberty for everybody. So next slide. And these 6 principles were distilled from countless different religious liberty judicial opinions. They were also informed by a series of convenings that we held with a really diverse group of attorneys, advocates, and faith leaders over the course of several years. And the 6 principles that we ended up landing on are that religious liberty must be first neutral. In other words, the government can't single out certain theological communities or beliefs for special persecution or for special protection. Non-coercive, as in the whole point of religious liberty is to allow everyone to follow their own conscience rather than being coerced to comply with either the religious beliefs, certainly of government officials, or of their fellow citizens. Non-discriminatory, I think it's really key to remember that civil rights laws banning religious discrimination are what enable people of all faiths, but especially religious minorities, to fully participate in civil society. So when we think about policies that are really creating carve-outs or undermining civil rights laws in the name of religious liberty, those carve-outs are ultimately going to limit the ability of religious minorities to openly practice their faith without fear of facing all sorts of discrimination. So they're really undermining the very right that they claim to protect. Religious liberty rights are not absolute, and this should really be a no-brainer. No constitutional right is absolute. Where are there other really important government interests at stake? We can place limits on religious liberty, and the courts know this because they place these limits all the time for certain religious liberty cases, particularly those coming out from people in prison. Religious liberty must be democratic. So right now, rather than kind of trying their best to equally protect religious beliefs of all individuals, or in the case of a direct conflict, protecting the religious rights of those with less social and political power, a lot of proposed religious exemptions do the opposite, in that they protect the rights and the practices of for-profit corporations, employers, and others who are kind of already overrepresented in the democratic process. So again, like big companies and employers over people like workers and consumers. I think that it makes sense to do the opposite, which is taking extra care to protect the religious beliefs of those with kind of the least political power and influence. And then finally, religious liberty must be pluralistic. And this really goes to that issue of not conflating religious liberty with white conservative Christianity, even entirely unintentionally. And one piece of this that I'd really like to talk about is trying to reject as much as we can kind of a religion versus LGBTQ rights or religion versus reproductive rights framework that we see so often. Obviously, for many people, their religious freedom is not in conflict with reproductive justice and LGBTQ equality. But I think also this is kind of zero-sum framework brushes over the fact the right to make your own religious and moral choices about your sexual and your family life without fear of losing your home or losing your job. It's not just a secular equality, right? It's also essential to having this freedom of conscience and freedom to live out your religious and moral values. So I am going to stop there. I think I've already gone over time, but I really look forward to the other presentations and discussion today.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a rich introduction to Religion Law 101 and a very necessary one. I think it's critically important that people understand all that you outlined for us in this conversation about the religious liberty protections on the federal and the state level, what that looks like, in addition to how you unpacked the All Faiths and None report, which is one of my reports that I love to share with other people, because it's so critically important that religious freedom laws are applied in ways that that prioritize everyone. And so thank you so much for that presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Mandisa Thomas. Mandisa Thomas is a native of New York City and the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers Incorporated. Although never formally indoctrinated into belief, Mandisa was heavily exposed to Christianity, Black nationalism, and Islam. As a child, she loved reading and enjoyed various tales of gods from different cultures, including Greek and Ghanaian gods. Through reading these stories and being taught about other cultures at an early age, she says, I quickly noticed that there were similarities and differences between those deities and the God of the Christian Bible. I couldn't help but wonder what made this God so special that he warrants such prevalence today, she recalls. Mandisa has had many media appearances to her credit, including CBS Sunday Morning, CNN.com, Playboy, The Humanist, Jet Magazine, and has been a guest on several podcasts, including NPR's Code Switch and 1A. And Mandisa has been featured as well in documentaries such as Contradiction and My Week in Atheism. We're delighted that Mandisa is with us today because she's also a human celebrant, as well as been recognized by many organizations for her incredible work. And so we're honored that Mandisa is with us and that Mandisa really encourages more Blacks to come out and stand strong in their non-belief in the face of such strong religious overtones. And she says, the more we make our presence known, the better our chances of working together to turn around some of the disparities we face. We are not alone. So with that, I would like to welcome my friend and colleague, Mandisa Thomas, to the screen.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, for that amazing introduction. I really appreciate it. And I also am proud to be here along with my fellow panelists, as well as everyone who is tuning in this morning. It is an honor to speak with you today. I am joining you. I'm currently in San Antonio, Texas, for the Freedom from Religion Foundation's annual convention, where our position is that this country was founded on the basis of freedom of religion, which also includes freedom from religion. And just so that I can specifically define the term and my identity, I do identify as an atheist, which means I do not subscribe to any belief in gods, spirits, or supernatural beings. Contrary to what many may think, this position is not one, or at least mine, is not one that is rooted in anger or resentment towards any particular belief system, but it was rooted in education, critical thought, and the ability to change my mind when valid evidence and information is presented, as well as the ability to reject the premise when said evidence and information is lacking or not there at all. And my personal perspective does come from a love for my Black community and my people who have been disproportionately impacted, particularly by Christianity in this country. And as we discuss rights in this country, for many Black people, identifying with the founding fathers and the founding of the United States is complicated and complex. And as Andrea discussed earlier, to know that freedom for all at that time meant only Anglo-Saxon landowners can be difficult to reconcile, along with the fact that only a little over 50 years ago, we were still fighting for our civil and human rights to be passed into law and to be recognized in the hearts and minds of everyone. It is important to acknowledge that many institutions and their founders and leaders perpetuated and benefited from systems of slavery, systems of oppression, which included suppressing the right to vote for many Black people. While this history cannot be unlived, facing these difficult truths allows us to do our best work going forward. Now, a bit about my organization, Black Nonbelievers. We not only sustain community and space for atheists and humanists and other who have a similar identity or similar non-religious identity, we also uphold and advocate for human rights of all, particularly LGBTQ plus people. We support separation of church and state. We support reproductive justice and choices, as well as death with dignity. We also advocate for comprehensive education, including sex and religion, that is free from dogma and stigma, something that we know a lot about. And we contend that people should be free to express their non-belief without retribution. In addition, we honor the history and legacies of Black humanists, freethinkers, atheists, etc., who were activists, creative artists, educators, and more. Some, like A. Philip Randolph, who was key to the March on Washington, and others, most recently former Senator Ernie Chambers from Nebraska, were on the front lines for our civil and human rights. Now, the numbers of the non-religious are rising. According to Pew Research, we are now close to, if not over 30% in the United States. However, there are still 7 states which ban atheists from holding public office. And those states are Arkansas, Maryland, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. Now, Pennsylvania is on the border of that. Now, while the US Constitution does not specifically prohibit this, the fact that there are states that have these laws on the books is a huge problem and is a direct violation of our civil rights and liberties. In addition, while the overall number of nuns is rising, research shows that approximately 79% of the Black population in the United States still places belief at the center of their lives. The US, the Black Non-Religious Report, Non-Religious Americans Report, which was jointly released with Black Nonbelievers and American Atheists in October of 21, which was based on the US Secular Survey, details higher levels of concealment and depression among Black non-religious folks, and does highlight the unique challenges that we face. Fortunately, in the years since Black Nonbelievers was founded and we have been doing our very important community work and advocacy, we are seeing some good growth and change. For example, on January 22nd of this year, in collaboration with the Pittsburgh Free Thought Society, we presented the Black Non-Religious Fight for Racial Justice, that we presented that panel for the annual Racial Justice, the Pittsburgh Racial Justice Summit, along with my colleague, Chris Cameron, who is the author of Black Freethinkers, and also my friend and colleague, Dr. Sabrina Dent. This panel highlighted the history of Black humanism and racial justice movements, the work of Black nonbelievers, and how religious freedom work is crucial for anti-racism and most certainly Christian nationalism. And with that, I would like to end by saying to my religious colleagues, we have some serious work ahead. The overturning of the Roe versus Wade decision is just but one example of proof of this. And with that in mind, I would like to urge you to do not turn to your neighbor and presume a belief in God, but do see if what we do is good. We are in a unique position to work together. In fact, it is imperative to do so. Do find and support and work with non-religious and progressive constituents and representatives. And I'm happy to highlight today that in Congress, there is the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, if you weren't already aware, which does include religious progressives and non-religious representatives. Also support the bills like the Do No Harm Act, which counters the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And when we speak, please listen. Do open yourselves to difficult conversations about how religion has impacted our communities and what we can do to offer evidence-based solutions to turn things around. Do urge your representatives as well, alongside us, to include the non-religious in their messaging. And if you are doing very important work that impacts the entire community, do not be afraid to work with us. Many of us care about the same things, even if we have varied perspectives. It should not be a deal breaker to know that there is, or it also should not be difficult for non-believers and atheists to work alongside you and your religious perspective is on full display. It is about human rights. And right now, Christian nationalism is a threat to our human rights and our human existence. And we must fight to work together on this. And just as there are many other organizations and people who encourage voting, so do we. And that is going to be one of the major things that helps us turn what we're dealing with around. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mandisa. Thank you. I appreciate the words that you offered and telling us the history of Black non-believers, as well as the contributions of free thinkers in society. And it's so important that people understand, like, that they celebrate these individuals every day, right? In many different ways. And so I love that you said, do not turn to your neighbor to look to them to see if they believe in a God. Look to see if they're doing good. I love that. I love that so much. Thank you so much, Mandisa, for what you shared. And I will have more questions during the Q&A. And so finally, I want to also introduce our last presenter of the morning, Reverend Alex Patchin McNeill. Reverend Alex Patchin McNeill is an ordained minister of the Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. For more than 12 years, he has focused on his ministry on leading initiatives of inclusion and equity as a nonprofit executive, coach, and consultant. Alex currently serves as a partner at the Management Center, coaching clients in the progressive sector to articulate and act on their vision for a more just world. Prior to joining the Management Center, Alex serves as the executive director of More Light Presbyterians for over 8 years. At More Light Presbyterians, Alex empowered and equipped hundreds of faith communities to visibly and tangibly expand inclusion for LGBTQIA plus people and implement anti-racist practices for deeper equity. As a nonprofit leader and activist, Alex has worked to elect LGBTQ plus leaders, advocated for reproductive justice, and won a state, national, and denominational legislation affirming and protecting the rights and dignities of queer and trans people. Before earning a Master's Divinity degree from Harvard University, Alex got his start in LGBTQ plus and reproductive rights activism as an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Alex is a white, queer, transgender man, an ordained minister and certified coach through the International Coaching Federation. Alex lives in Asheville, North Carolina, where he can be found kayaking with his dog Spike, hiking in the mountains, and planning adventures with his partner. And today, Alex is here with us. Reverend Alex, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. And we'll bring you to the screen. Well, you're already here to share your remarks.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's an honor to get to partner with you and all of you as panelists in this important conversation. I never thought I'd be dedicating my career to talking about religious liberty, but it seems that it's been an issue on the table from the beginning. So I'm glad to get to add some more texture to this conversation. So as Sabrina shared, I am a transgender man and an ordained minister. And I want to start my journey into this work from that standpoint. I remember the day when I realized that the church's laws and God's law of love for humanity were different from one another. That I realized that the church could get their interpretation of God's love wrong. I was 18, it was early 2000s, and I was discerning a call to ministry and coming to terms with my sexual orientation, with my queerness. Realizing at the time, the denomination where I was raised, the Presbyterian Church USA, had laws on the books restricting openly LGBTQ folks from becoming ministers. So the very thing I felt God was calling me to do was the very thing that my denomination was restricting me from. And I wrestled with that growing up, thinking that perhaps the church's law was getting God's interpretation right. And it was when I was 18 that I realized, actually, God and who I believe in as a deity is on the side of all of humanity. And the church had misinterpreted that. So I went forward and pursued ordination in a denomination whose laws we had to change in order for everyone to be able to be at the table. It was a few years later when I realized just how much a misinterpretation of God's law of love for all of God's creation could be wielded so blatantly to restrict the lives and livelihoods of queer and trans people, reinforcing historic oppression of BIPOC people, immigrants, restricting reproductive justice, and so on. I realized that fundamentally, these misinterpretations are actually questions about who counts as human and what kind of treatment that human is entitled to. I so appreciated Andrea's pointing us back to the Constitution, a fundamental question of who gets to vote, who counts as a full person in this nation. I've come to realize that, to me, what defines Christian nationalism is a focus on constricting and restricting freedoms, rights, livelihoods, and even the very existence of marginalized people. We think about the Don't Say Gay bill, as was referenced earlier by Sabrina, that's passed in Florida and now is being considered as federal legislation. If you can't speak about LGBTQ folks, do we exist? That's the hope, that we don't, from those folks. So realizing that everything that Christian nationalism is trying to do is restricting who counts as human, which is a theological question, as I was trained. Who is human is a question of great theological importance. And to me, I love the presentation that Liz gave around like what defines religious liberty. This is about expanding and being pluralistic and opening freedoms for people who are already human living on this planet to continue to exist as such. I want to spend some time really giving some shape and texture to what does it look like right now in terms of how Christian nationalism is attacking specifically LGBTQIA plus folks, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and all of God's diversity of sexuality and gender identity. Because it has ramped up significantly in the past, let's say 5 to 6 years. So when I finished seminary in 2008, that was the year of Prop 8 in California, when there was questions around marriage equality and would marriage equality start to be opened for same-sex couples. And as soon as the Supreme Court in 2015 passed the decision that marriage equality was federally recognized, right-wing Christians got very scared and decided that we're actually going to go after LGBTQ folks to try and regroup and gain some ground that had been lost in this cultural understanding of LGBTQ folks' right to exist. So I'm from North Carolina, one of those states that has some pretty bad histories around voting rights in all kinds of ways. And I moved here from DC back to my home state in 2016, which was in 2 weeks before House Bill 2 was passed by the North Carolina legislature, that actually, was really recognized as the bathroom bill, restricting transgender folks' ability to use a bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity and forcing transgender people to use a bathroom that's on their birth certificate. So for me as a transgender man, at the time, it would have meant I had to use the women's facilities, which nobody wants. And it also, HB2 was going after minimum wage, voting rights. There was all kinds of stuff stuffed into that bill that we don't often talk about, but House Bill 2 in North Carolina really kicked off and was model legislation for a wave of bills that have increased year upon year, almost exponentially, it feels like, attacking LGBTQIA plus folks. So there was an amazing article that I'll actually put in the chat later that the Washington Post just published about a week ago called Anti-Transgender Laws Are on the Rise. And it really details this escalation. But I want to pull a quote that exemplifies how these bills are tied to Christian nationalism, this singular vision for who is Christian and who counts as human in our country that's tied to white identities, it's tied to heterosexuals, it's tied to all the things that that Liz kind of shared in the presentation. But recently, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey tweeted upon signing a gender-affirming care ban in their state earlier this year, said, the reason for this is, we're going to go by how God made us. If the good Lord made you a boy, you're a boy. And if he made you a girl, you're a girl. It's simple. So we're enacting this law banning gender affirming care because of our belief about who God made us to be. And that gender is immutable. You cannot change your gender according to their religious beliefs. And so in the past, particularly 4 years, there has been an increased escalation of these kinds of bills year upon year. So in 2018, there were just 19 bills. By 2020, there were 60 bills. In 2022, there have been 155 bills attacking specifically transgender and gender identity, a total of 162 bills, which is the highest ever. Now, we can say that of the 350 bills that have been introduced attacking LGBTQ folks, maybe only 32 are getting passed of that, but it actually has the really damaging and far-reaching consequence of restricting rhetoric, restricting people's sense of safety. Parents in particular, I think Sabrina, you talked about talking to a parent of a trans child. Many people are truly and reasonably afraid of what happens when these bills continue to be introduced and passed. And as ACLU Chase Strangio predicts, these bills are only going to increase because they're marching to the 2024 election, presidential election. This is a wedge issue to drive voter turnout, and really posit a vision of Christian nationalism that they want to see, that you can't change your gender, you're born the way God made you, supposedly, and you're going to be married in a heterosexual relationship. It's all about restricting and controlling gender and sexuality. And what's so alarming, the bathroom bill in 2016 was scary, but what's happening now in the escalation of the kind of language of these bills is that it's about criminalization, criminalizing healthcare providers, criminalizing parents who seek treatment for their transgender children, criminalizing, sound familiar? For those of us who've worked in reproductive justice spaces, it's the exact same playbook, truthfully, and criminalization of folks who are Black and Indigenous has long been part of the playbook of their religious right. But now it's really kind of continuing to be broadened in a very scary way. I think that the deep rationale that it's never about saying we're trying to establish a Christian nation until it is, but often the rationale is around protecting children from taking medical action, protecting other children from trans folks, another theological idea around, when do children know themselves? When do children have the right to determine who they are called to be in this world? And ultimately restricting particularly children and their parents' access to healthcare and gender affirming care comes down to another Christian nationalist argument, which is that you don't want to change your body because, quote, children are too young to know and they might want to become parents later in life, which is another tenet of this vision of what it means to live in this Christian nation, which is that marriage is for the purposes of reproduction. So I offer that texture, and I want to offer a counterpoint quickly, which is, so why not abandon Christianity? Why not leave it behind if it's done so many awful things? And I have dedicated my life to supporting people of faith to speak up, to get in touch with the expansive vision that God has given us for who God loves and how we are called to live in community with one another. That very same week that House Bill 2 was passed in North Carolina, as many trans folks and their loved ones were deeply afraid of how we were going to be able to navigate living in this state, I got calls from all kinds of faith communities asking me, how do we fight back? Where can we take action? Can we have a single stall bathroom for folks to use and access that affirms their gender? And I got to say, yes, you can do all of those things. You can stand up and share with your elected representatives why this can't be in the name of your faith. And I've seen that happen over and over again, from Texas to Alabama to North Carolina and everywhere in between, that people of faith and of no faith have a deep moral obligation to hold that religious liberty is part of our rights. It's part of our fundamental access in this country that this country was founded on, as we have talked about. So I offer that vision that we don't have to abandon what we believe in to advocate for LGBTQ folks in particular and reproductive justice, that actually the world is calling us to really be firm in what we believe and share that as openly where and when we can. So I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Reverend Alex. Ms. Andrea put exactly in the chat what I was reflecting on. Those last words of people of faith and moral obligation have a deep, this deep responsibility and conviction to do this work, right? That's why religious freedom matters. That's why human dignity matters. And I want to thank you so much, Reverend Alex, for telling your story and about your journey, because I do know it requires for you to be vulnerable in these spaces, all of you to be vulnerable in these spaces and having this very public conversation. And so I would love to bring all of you onto the screen so we can engage in a dialogue about some of the information that you've shared with our attendees. And I want to encourage our attendees that if you have questions, please put them in the chat, so we can address them at some point when we get to the Q&A part of our session together. So thank you all for contributing to this very thoughtful conversation. It was like this roadmap that we went on in terms of looking at history in the United States with voting rights, and also looking at the legal education piece of it, talking about how non-religious and secular individuals are impacted by some of the very laws that have been put in place that really promote and Christian nationalist ideas or Christianity more than other traditions. And then at the same time, Reverend Alex, how you brought that home and talking about the impact on LGBTQIA plus communities and the work that still needs to happen. One of the things that was very clear to me in this conversation was how the question of what does it mean to be human and who is human also determines and makes it so that we consistently have to shape new narratives and new policies to help define the humanity of those of us that are not considered human by those that identify with the founding framers of this country, right? It's like there is a specific idea, notion of what does it mean to be human. And I want to know from you all, because also in hearing that, there is this increase of policy and efforts to undermine our humanness and our being and however we show up. I mean, one of the things that Reverend Alice talked about is like you started with the small numbers, then it went to 60, then it went to 155 bills, and then, you know, the numbers in terms of the voting rights. It's like there's this continued increase in that. How do you, as practitioners, as thought leaders, as advocates, how do you lead into this conversation, and how do you want to encourage the people that are watching to think about this in their everyday context? And I'm put it plainly in this way. I raised the question in my notes to you all. I said, this work takes a lot out of all of us. It is exhausting. I'm just be straight up. Advocacy work is exhausting. So what do you want our listeners to gather from this conversation as to, one, what are things that they can do to help change the narrative? Two, how do they take action in their communities? Going back to the comment that Mandisa stated about not looking for the God, but looking for the good that the person does. Like, how do we want people to walk away from this conversation? What is your priority in your sharing today?
I'll start.
Go ahead.
I think what is important is for us to see perspectives that are beyond us, or how we were beyond how we were indoctrinated, right? It's most of the time people may get involved when something directly affects them, whether it is directly or a family member or someone close to them, and it shouldn't have to take that. It should not have to take for something to impact you directly in order to take a stand or in order to get involved. Now, I do this work in part because of my children. You know, I do want to make sure that not only are they treated better, but that they are also in a position where they can do better for others. And it is important to have a more communal and community-based mindset, that we are not just simply thinking of ourselves and how we are impacted or even how we can benefit, because this is where a lot of this stuff comes in. That and to look beyond our an individualistic mindset. Now, there is nothing wrong with obtaining more for yourself and bettering yourself. However, it cannot be at the expense of other people. And that is where, you know, that is where a lot of this rests.
Thank you, Mandisa. Anyone else want to jump in? Yes, Liz.
Sure. I think kind of what I would add to that is, I think, you know, getting involved can often feel so daunting because we're dealing with these massive institutions. How can I, as an individual, possibly influence Congress or the Supreme Court? I mean, it just seems so daunting. And I would say so many of these issues are so local. And so maybe start with thinking about, you know, is there something small going on in my community that I can get involved with? Is there a mosque that's facing harassment or that's struggling to open space because they're getting stymied by, you know, the local whatever powers that be? Is there you know, a Don't Say Gay bill or an anti-trans bill or an anti-critical race theory bill? Or does my state have one of these state laws, you know, barring atheists from taking office that Mandisa mentioned, that kind of everyone's just been ignoring? Is there a place for me to get involved, or my house of worship to get involved, or my, my student group, or whatever it is. So yeah, recently we had a really fantastic win right here in New York City, which is a very safe state right now for abortion rights, obviously, where the Barnard students organized to get medication abortion available to students on campus. So look for little kind of things you can chip away at that may seem small as compared to winning a Supreme Court case, but really make a real significant difference in people's lives.
Great. And Liz, I'm glad that I want to touch on what you just said. Like what you just mentioned, you said something small, right? Like people don't realize like those small victories are major victories for the community that is impacted by whatever issue is happening. So people sometimes say, well, a lot of times people question like, oh, I don't know what to do, right? Well, when you see your elected official then asking for a public comment to be submitted, you're the public. Right? You're a citizen of whatever area. You have the option to do so. And that's one of the things that even the center, when we saw that Governor Youngkin proposed the model policies here in the state of Virginia that were targeting LGBTQ, specifically transgender students, we said, what can we do? And I'm happy because one of my colleagues, one of the faith leaders is on right now, that joined us in this effort, but we were just like, okay, well, if he opened it up for public comment, let's push it. Let's push for people to oppose this piece of legislation. So that's something simple that people could do. Use your voice. And if you want to submit anonymously, you can do that. Some portals are set up where you can submit anonymously, but those small steps like make major differences for those communities. Ms. Andrea, I see it looks like you were you going to share something?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Now, in my world, I live in that go big or go home space. So I have been advocating for constitutional amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, to officially take women from basically being, for all intents and purposes, property. So as a Black Cherokee woman, so much of my identity has been defined by the powers that be as not human at all. Well, all right, we'll give you maybe 3/5 human, property, breeding machine. And I accept none, absolutely none of those definitions. So when I fight back, I will fight back at the state level. I also fight back at the federal level, understanding that there are fewer people willing to go in that space, but providing training and guidance to help more and more people take up that battle at local, state, and federal level.
Thank you, Ms. Andrea. And I know one of the ways that you also do your work is through the trainings that you all offer through the center, and telling and encouraging people, especially right now in this moment of voter mobilization, which is so critical for people to get involved. If you haven't checked your registration and you still have time to do so, do so. And also make sure you check your polling place. One of the things I talked about at the top of the conversation is gerrymandering is real. Redistricting is real. There are efforts that have happened. And so there are things that we can do as individuals to take action. Reverend Alex, I see you've come off of mute there. Please join us in this.
I really, yes, to everything that's been said. And the thing I just want to highlight, particularly for this space, is for us to think pluralistically, that I think many of us who are of a faith have been indoctrinated into almost religious exceptionalism, that our faith is the one. And I'd like us to be called to pluralism, that we believe in our own faith, sure, and not at the expense of other faiths or no faith. And I think taking that from this helps us start to resist the very fundamentals of Christian nationalism, like in our minds and in our bodies. So then we can go out to the polls, to our elected representatives. And I really want to also add joining with groups in your local community. You don't have to do this alone. There are a lot of people fighting for this who deserve your volunteer, your dollars, your support, so that we can, as a community, really work to eradicate Christian nationalism at its root.
Yes, I think that is so important in thinking about pluralism, right? One of the things that we were intentional about, even in shaping this conference, was to think through a pluralistic mindset of the issues that impact all the different communities that we've brought up in this conversation today. And speaking to, because you both mentioned something about Christian nationalism, that we talked about how Christian nationalism, and Mandisa said, Christian nationalism is a threat to human rights, right? At the same time, Reverend Alex, you said how Christian nationalism restricts who identifies as human, right? Like this is this ideology, and I want to clarify because I see that, you know, some people are joining us late because the links got mixed up, but I want to clarify for those that are joining us that missed this at the top of the conversation, that there is a difference between Christian nationalism and Christianity, and people need to understand those distinctions. And I should say this, Christianities, because there are many different denominations, and if you go to any one of those communities and try to do a rite or a ritual the way another community does it is different. But the reality of it is that at the root of this, that a Christian nationalism is being promoted by a small sect of Christians who have this dangerous ideology that believes that what it means to be American means that you have to be Christian or to accept those ideals as a part of your identity, and also to be patriotic. But it's through the lens of a white male Christian experience, right? Heterosexual male Christian experience, I'm gonna say that. So, and so it's important for us to understand that distinction. In this conversation, what we've talked about is how it has impact as far as voting rights, how it impacts in terms of reproductive justice, how it impacts in public schools, how it impacts LGBTQIA individuals and non-religious and secular people. But Liz, I want to go back to you for a moment, because when you talked about religious liberty protections, you talked about it on the federal and the state level. And then you mentioned in one of your examples, you talked about how religious leaders have had cases brought against them because of how they may have been, as part of their service, right? They have been like providing water for those in the desert. And I know one example of that case is Reverend Kaji Dosa in New York, who was, that the government basically was watching her because she had provided water and provision. Can you speak more to an example of such as to why people need to understand? And here's the thing, we don't encourage people to break the law. That's not what we're doing. But where is the fine line in how one group's rights then overshadows another group's? And we know that violates like church-state separation, because again, the establishment clause basically says that the government cannot show preference. But here we are. Can you speak to that a little bit more, please?
All right, there's a lot there. So I'm going to try to pull out a couple threads. Well, you mentioned not breaking the law. One thing I just think it's really important for us to always to remember is there's a really big distinction between requesting a religious exemption and committing civil disobedience. Right. So that's always something we talk about when people are curious about this whole scheme of religious exemptions. Religious exemptions are about standing and saying, actually, this law, it's not necessarily that I think it's bad for everyone, although maybe I do, but it violates my religious practice, and therefore I get an exemption, but other people don't, right? Whereas civil disobedience was a very different kind of political tactic that's about standing up and saying, I am going to break the law and I'm going to accept the consequences because this is an immoral law, right? They're two very different political tactics. So I just want to kind of note that first. The cases that you talked about, there are a handful that came out of the sanctuary movement. Then there's the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, but then the new sanctuary movement of the 2000s and 2010s that involved folks from the group No More Deaths that were, criminally prosecuted under the Trump administration for leaving food and water in the desert for migrants crossing into the United States. And actually won their religious liberty defense, and saying that, their kind of stance was that humanitarian aid is never a crime, but also that they were doing this out of their deeply held faith, and therefore it should be protected. And there's actually a long history of many cases that are in this kind of model of service to the public, whether it's opening a homeless shelter on your church or giving out, in violation of perhaps either land use or public health claims, giving out food service programs, that religious communities have a right to do this. So it was kind of in that vein. And Reverend Kaji also, as you mentioned, brought a claim essentially saying that she was being targeted and surveilled by the government because of the religiously motivated service with and on behalf of migrants. So those are some of the cases that were outlined in our Whose Faith Matters report, which I'll just take that opportunity to plug again if you're really interested in these claims. And finally, I'll just try to briefly touch on your kind of what is the difference between these kinds of claims versus the right to, for example, deny reproductive health care to people based on your religious beliefs. And that goes to this idea of a third-party harm doctrine in the law that some people have articulated, which is that your right to religious liberty kind of goes as far as it stops at the moment that you are working off of the backs of other people's rights. Essentially, the other people are essentially being co-opted into giving up their rights in order to protect their religious beliefs. That's kind of a doctrine that I certainly believe in adamantly. That said, we have a current, I just want to kind of give the reality that we have a current Supreme Court that essentially believes that almost any attempt to enforce the Establishment Clause violates the Free Exercise Clause. So there's a difference between what the Establishment Clause should be doing for us and what it is doing for us. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Does anyone want to add anything or respond to that? Because I do have a thought about what came up earlier. And Reverend Alex, I believe you used this language of criminalizing people, right? And when you think about, for me, when I do my work and I think about these conversations, I think about the issues, I'm like, who is the person that's being impacted at the end of this? What are their identities, right? Because that's something to look at when we're looking at how policies and laws are being changed to prioritize or privilege one group or another. Who is then sitting at the bottom of that? And so I think it's so important in reflecting on rights that we think about the intersectionality of a person's identities and how they're showing up in the world when we're talking about this issue. One of the things that I also want to come back to Ms. Andrea and ask you about, because you talked about the voting rights bills. And we know that the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill nor the Freedom to Vote Act passed this year, right? And that's a major, and we work on the Faithful Democracy Coalition, where we work with colleagues that have been, and their organizations have been meeting with people on the Hill and having these conversations. And we know that in these conversations that the public is not privileged to sometimes, that there have been things stated like, if certain words or certain language shows up in a bill, that they're not willing to pass it. But yet right now we're in the space of there being a focus around ECA reform. Can you talk a little bit about ECA reform and what, if anything, does that do? Because there are the federal elections and then there are the state elections. And where we see these bills happening that are targeting, transgender students, non-religious people, women, we see these coming from the states.
Right.
So can you speak more to what's happening with ECA, and why should people pay attention to any of this, right? As again, I can't say enough, November 8th is coming. And so all of these issues that we're talking about, these are on the ballot in the form of the candidates that you're looking at.
Yes.
We're a nonpartisan organization, I will state that.
Right. Well, number one, any law that is going to impact your ability to vote and or how they count the vote, what constitutes a real vote, must be very, very, very carefully scrutinized. And so what happened was they basically gave up in the 117th Congress of being able to protect voting rights because there was no language. They could not get it through the Senate. So they decided, let's concentrate on how we count votes. When does it happen? How does it happen? Who will the people who certify elections be? Because remember, January 6th happened immediately after the Georgia election. Literally, it was one day. So while the Electoral Count Act is another one of those necessary pieces of legislation, there's a whole collection that really all needs to go together to be able to protect elections in the United States.
Thank you, Ms.
So
Andrea.
if nobody can vote, do we really care how they count?
There we go. That's a word right there. So I wanted to encourage the attendees that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to forego having our small groups because it's a smaller, intimate group here. But please put a Q in front of it so we can recognize it. Reverend Alex and Mandisa, I actually have a question specifically for you too, because one of the things that came out of your presentation and then my opening remarks was the fact that we talked about the impact of religious discrimination, religious privilege, Christian nationalism, how this has impact on youth, right? And I think it's very important. Not enough people have the conversations around mental health and conversations about the impact on Christian nationalism, that Christian nationalism has on the mental health of individuals. Now, we as adults, if we get frustrated, and I know I get tired of seeing some of the things that come out, even the comments that came out recently from Vice President Mike Pence, as well as other comments that people put out into the public square, is very frustrating. What would you say to someone that is watching that's like, oh, you know what? Okay, Christian nationalism, I could get with that. But this data around depression and suicide, because as I stated earlier, the Trevor report said, that 1.8 million youth, right, LGBTQ youth are impacted every year by, having thoughts of suicide or depression around this issue. So can you speak to what is our moral obligation and responsibility in addressing this in our communities? For those that are a part of faith communities, and I really want to say this, Mandisa, and the reason why I want you to weigh in on this is that, there was an article that I wrote earlier this year for the Religion News Service. And in that, I basically, it was kind of like, it wasn't much of a love letter, but it was a love letter to the Black church saying, hey, LGBTQ rights is issue, and we've always taken up civil rights issues, right? So we can't stop now, because over 70% of LGBTQ people do identify as religious. So these are people that are part of our communities. So can the two of you speak to what is our moral obligation and responsibility? What should people take away in this conversation as it pertains to LGBTQ youth, and what we need to do in terms of listening, taking action? I would love to hear your feedback.
Alex, if you want to go first, since I started first, then that would be great. I mean, I certainly will yield the floor.
The thing that comes to mind, we start talking about religious liberty, the Constitution, religious freedom. It starts to feel really heady. It's like, do we need to go to law school? I feel like I've been to law school today in a great way from Liz, and then I've got my civics course from Andrea, to kind of wrap your mind around it. But Sabrina, you're pointing to the very human cost, that these actions are really about defining what, restricting, constricting bodies, hearts, minds, spirits. And that's the real point, is if you can't say gay, you shouldn't think about it. And if you can't access gender affirming care, then you can't be in the body that you so desperately at a soul level hunger to be in. And so to me, what keeps me going, and what can also just be that scope that feels so painful about all this is the human cost of these laws. And what keeps me going is finding moments of resistance. Parents, people, educators who, we are everywhere, LGBTQ folks. We're in all these states that are trying to pass these laws, and our parents and our families and loved ones are too. So experiencing that rally of community can be the very thing that keeps people going. The suicidality rates diminish significantly when just one person expresses care and concern in a young person's life, particularly. And that's why the governor of Utah tried to veto a ban that was going against trans youth. He's like, there's like 3 people playing sports in this state who are trans, but the congressional state Congress overruled him. But the point is that there's so much attack against our hearts, minds, and spirits, that's also a level of resistance that we can offer each other. And so I think that's what I would offer, is where can we reach out to another and see and support each other in these struggles, because the worst thing to feel is alone.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to expound on that. And there is an elephant in the room that I would like to at least address, is that there has been trauma and harm caused by religious belief. There are many people who suffer from religious trauma, and many of these people still belong to a denomination or a religion. And we have to acknowledge that. Right. We have to have these conversations and discussions and even discourse about how this has been a problem. It has been codified into law. It has impacted racism. It has impacted the rights of women. It has impacted the rights of the LGBTQ plus community, many of whom intersect. And there are a lot of people, when we talk about young people who are among the fastest rising demographic of the non-religious, there are a lot of younger people who are coming out. But again, the support and, in overcoming and healing from that trauma still needs to be addressed. And fortunately, in our community, in the secular community, we are encouraging people to seek clinical help for religious trauma and those indoctrinations and overcoming them. We've partnered, Black Nonbelievers has partnered with My Choice and Power Counseling to offer religious trauma group coaching, which is facilitated by a professional. And it is important that we are holding our clinicians responsible, because there are many of them who are still reinforcing their belief into their practices, and that needs to stop. If you are helping people clinically, your beliefs do not belong there. And or if you are imparting your beliefs in any way, they should be to help the individual, not based on simply what you think, what your belief system is. So it's important to speak up about these things. It's important to acknowledge that the trauma and the oppression that we faced is rooted in religious trauma, and in a lot of ways. And it doesn't mean that you have to give up on what you believe. It certainly means, though, that there is a huge problem institutionally that still needs to be addressed and resolved.
Yes, Mandisa, I'm so glad that you named that and that you stated it, because that is real. Moral injuries that have come from religious institutions are so real, and it's even it's every religious group has caused some harm or trauma towards a community of people, and so yes, that needs to be named and stated. It made me come to mind, or my thoughts came to mind about the video that came out a few months ago, the movie Honk for Jesus, and people were so frustrated that, they were just like, no, this is blasphemous that they would talk about. And I'm like, this is the real experience of people within religious communities. And here's the thing, I say that as an advocate for religious freedom. I say that for someone that will protect anyone's right to believe or not to believe, but we have to speak to the traumas that people experience and cannot ignore those. If we do, we're really hypocrites of the work that we say we were called to do, and that's to love and to serve community. So I appreciate you naming that. And I say that even as the daughter of a Pentecostal preacher, that yes, there have been traumas that I even witnessed growing up and that I still see happen. So yes, we have a moral obligation and a responsibility to say that, to speak it, and to really, as you talked about, Reverend Alex, like, be that one adult, be that one caring adult that listens, and that is present for someone that needs to be loved and affirmed, especially when you see that they are in a community where they're often targeted, right? It's a lot being a child, period, right? It's a lot being an adult, but it's a lot being a child and just navigating life. So to have someone that listens and cares is so important. One of the things I want to do before we close out this session is to just think about this. What happens if we stop? What happens if we stop having these conversations? Because some people say enough is enough. You've talked about this too long. Yes, I've talked about it for a long time, but laws keep popping up on the books. People keep still acting like people keep still discriminating against other individuals. What happens if we stop doing this work? Liz, what happens if you stop? What do we do? What do we do? And what gives you, I'm gonna frame it this way. In this moment, what gives all of you hope to move forward? What gives you hope? I'll start with you, Liz.
Sure. I mean, I think to some extent we're kind of seeing now what happens when progressives kind of walk back from the idea of religious liberty and allow the Christian right to be the dominant voice in the room on this issue. we're seeing how that just takes over the narrative, and how people like, Bill Barr and Mike Pence and Samuel Alito are being called in ostensibly, neutral way, like in major newspapers, leading advocates for religious liberty, when we all know that's absolutely not the case.
Right.
And that's absolutely not to discount all the amazing work that many individuals and groups, including those on this call, and I would say especially people from the atheist, secular, and humanist communities, have been doing for a really long time. But the investment has just been so incredibly lopsided. And so I guess if I feel like, to end on somewhat of a hopeful note, I am hopeful. I mean, I think the discourse on religious nationalism and religious trauma it seems to me to have really exploded over the past couple years. And I do think there's a renewed interest and willingness to engage in some really hard questions, and to look at, for particular faith communities to kind of look inside and see where they haven't been showing up, and where they have been kind of ceding this issue of religious liberty to the loudest voices in the room without making themselves known. So yeah, I'd love to know what everyone else has to say.
Thank you. Ms. Andrea.
In my world, the world of voting rights, I see so many of our faith partners standing up and working with us to ensure that people get the information that they need to vote. There is a new form of voter suppression that most people don't notice, and I call it suppression by technology. When we look at this country, there are many people who live in rural America who don't have broadband. There are many people who live in urban America who can't afford broadband. There are many older people and disabled people who really don't use technology. As we are opening up where and when people can vote, we are only making that information available to those who are privileged enough to know how and have the internet. So I just watch for all the different formats that voter suppression can and does take. Then we try to watch it, see it, identify it, figure out a way to move people past it. And I really don't want to think about what would happen if we did not do the work that we do and the scope with which we do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Alex.
I think at its heart, Christian nationalism is a power grab and an attempt to recapture what has been ebbing away, which is the fact that many people of faith and no faith are getting more pluralistic, are expanding our hearts and minds and our understanding of who is human and what kind of rights and recognition is afforded that humanity. And so I recenter in seeing it as that and recognizing that it is a very real threat. And if we stop, they win. And the world that they're working for, that dangerous world, becomes reality. But what keeps me going is exactly what everyone said, that so many are working to change that narrative. So many are working to continue to expand our understanding of humanity and our recognition of it. And this is going to be this push-pull for a while, but the more we can do to show up in our communities, to educate our children on an expansive worldview, then we're at this place where eventually the vision that we're working for will become the reality. Full stop.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Alex and Mandisa.
Now, I'll just be very brief. What keeps me going is knowing that the communities that we are building are helping to better inform people of their rights and what others are going through, and that there are religious allies, that we do have support and we are finding common ground in what we're fighting for, and that people are having a better understanding of what it means to and to destigmatize certain terms that might have been encouraged, but that might have been, you know, told that were evil, or that were, you know, and that we're no longer being othered, no matter who we are. Is that this is no longer an alternative. This is now a part of what we do every day and how we engage every day, and that is really important.
Thank you so much, Mandisa. Thank you all. I want to say that what gives me hope is being in conversation with all of you and also doing the work with you. I am so grateful to you, Liz Reiner Platt, Andrea Miller, Reverend Alex Patchin McNeill, and Mandisa Thomas for your thoughtful contributions in today's conversation, but the work that you do every day to move us forward in these different movements. I'm thankful also, and what brings me hope are the people that watch this conversation today, right, that engage. And those that will watch the recording of this, that gives me hope when I think of the world that I believe we can be, the beloved community that is inclusive of every single person. And so I want to thank you all for your participation in today's conversation. I want to remind our participants that at 12:45, we have a live musical performance by Robin and Von Ambrose with Yellow Door Concert Series. And so I invite you to come back at 12:45 for this performance, followed by our responsibilities panel that will take place at 1 p.m. You will get a confirmation with the link to join both the musical performance, which will also be the same link that you'll use to join us at 1 o'clock should you miss the musical performance. But I encourage you to come back. This is a treat. There are local artists here in Alexandria, Virginia. And again, I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank all of our panelists. Wishing you a great lunch break.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.